U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has arrived in Saudi Arabia for negotiations with Russia over the future of Ukraine. Absent from these talks, Ukraine. And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he will not accept a deal made behind his back. Be that as it may, what do Americans think about all this, and how has U.S. public opinion changed on this subject? One man knows the answer. CNN senior data reporter Harry Enten. When we talk about support for Ukraine, there's a bunch of different ways to ask about it, but it is clear there has been some movement.
Yeah, I think the real thing to note here is the trend line, Mr. Brennan, and just holy Toledo. Look at this trend line here. U.S. support for Ukraine is too much. Back when the war began, back in February of 2022, it was just 7%. Up like a rocket ship. My goodness. Up now in February of 2025 to 41%. And the clear majority of Republicans, and of course Republicans are in charge of the U.S. government now, 62% of Republicans say that the U.S. support for Ukraine is too much. What a difference from just 3 years ago. I can remember, John, all those backyards in the United States with those Ukrainian flags. Far fewer of them today, as Americans' opinions on Ukraine have changed dramatically.
What about opinions of the Ukrainian president?
Right. You know, obviously, if you would expect changes amongst the public on feelings towards Ukraine, feelings towards Zelensky have changed also dramatically. Look at this. Confident Zelensky will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. Back in 2022, it was the clear majority, 72% through the floor. Through the floor by 2024, just 48% of Americans say that they're confident that Zelensky will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. And GOP confidence has also plummeted dramatically. Now the clear majority of Republicans are not confident that Zelensky will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs. Really a real trend line, ones you rarely see in the American public when it comes to Ukraine and Zelensky. Confidence in both going down through the ground.
Look, some allies of President Trump have targeted Zelensky with harsh criticism over the last few years, and it could be that that's having some impact here.
Absolutely. The Republican establishment, the Republican electorate has moved as the Republican establishment and Republican leaders have moved on.
All right, let's talk about the idea of a peace deal. And again, the way you ask this matters, but go ahead.
The way you ask it is important, so we can talk about this a little bit. So the poll question essentially is, do you support a Russia-Ukraine negotiated peace deal? The vast majority of Americans, this is what they want. 78% say that they support this idea versus just 16% oppose. Of course, as we were talking about, does this question actually get at what's going on right now? I think you would say that it probably does not necessarily get what's going on right now.
No, the question asked, do you support a Russia-Ukraine negotiated peace deal? Ukraine's not there at the negotiations in Saudi Arabia this week, so the people were not asked this. And I do think, in general, if you ask anyone in any poll, do you support peace, peace tends to rate pretty highly.
Peace tends to win. You rarely get 78% of the country agreeing on anything. They do agree on the idea of a negotiated peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Whether the majority would agree on a Russia peace deal with Ukraine where Ukraine has nothing to do with it, that might be a different question.
Hard to know. Harry Enten, thank you.
Thank you,
much.
my friend.
Kate?
Also this morning, Ukrainian President Zelensky putting out new reaction to the meeting in Saudi Arabia that Ukraine is not part of, making clear that the war will not end if Ukraine is not involved.
Ukraine will not participate. Ukraine knew nothing about them. Ukraine perceives any negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine as those with no results. We cannot recognize anything or any agreements about us without us.
And joining us right now is retired Navy Admiral James Stavridis, a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, on with us now as a CNN senior military analyst, and we are lucky to have you. He's also a partner at the Carlyle Group, a global investment firm, serves on the boards or advises a handful of defense-related companies. Admiral, it's really good to see you once again. Thank you for coming in. First, I want to ask you first about the meeting happening today, this emergency meeting between European leaders, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and more, meeting in Paris to coordinate a response to these opening talks right now that Europe is blocked out of. What do you see as the options for Europe if they aren't brought in pretty quickly?
I think this meeting is excellent, and what it shows is the light is going on for the Europeans, that they've got to come together. When you put together the European nations' economies, their defense spending, It's always the second largest entity in the world after the United States. But individually, they don't have that throw weight. So as they come together, look for Emmanuel Macron of France, look for the UK's Keir Starmer, look for the German leader. All of them are going to try to push together this idea of European unity, particularly as they perceive, I think correctly, that the United States enthusiasm, as Harry just showed us, for the Ukrainian project is waning. It's time for Europe to step up. This is a good meeting.
And then let's look ahead to tomorrow. I want to play something else that we actually heard from Ukraine's president in an interview that aired over the weekend leading into this big meeting tomorrow between the U.S. and Russia.
Do you think President Trump is negotiating in good faith?
I hope so. I hope so. Yes, I count on it. I count on it very much.
Is Putin capable of negotiating in good faith?
No, you will see. Everybody will see. He will try to begin something new.
Admiral, where do you see this is going? What do you see is, I don't even know if you can call it a best case scenario or just the most likely scenario to come out of this right now?
Yeah, let's stay on the realism side of the equation, Kate. I think realistically, Putin has a pretty strong hand of cards to hold on to Crimea and the 4 provinces, the land bridge to Russia. That's about 20% of Ukraine. On the other hand, if the United States puts pressure on Putin, if we continue to support Ukraine, and if, as we discussed a moment ago, the Europeans step up, I think the remainder of Ukraine, that 80%, will sail on, democratic, free. Ultimately, it'll have a path to NATO, but one of Putin's conditions will be in the short term, no NATO membership. But to summarize, I think what you see in current terms of territoriality is probably what you're going to get, where the deal lands.
If it lands at 80-20, who then has won this war? How do you see that being decided?
I think Putin lost the war in that scenario. And you can argue about this, but don't forget, 3 years ago, his stated objective was to conquer the entire country, effectively absorb 40 million Ukrainians, all of that mineral resources, all of that agrarian capacity. He's getting 20% under this scenario. And look at that 20%, Kate. It's been a war zone for 3 years. It's full of unexploded ordnance. Its infrastructure is largely destroyed. And it is anything but the grand prize. Frankly, it's a bit of a poisoned chalice at this point, in that Putin would have to pay to do the reconstruction. And then finally, what else has he accomplished? He's strengthened NATO. He's brought Finland and Sweden into NATO. He's made the Baltic Sea a NATO lake, and he has brought the alliance to a position of operating together. I think in every sense, he's not a winner at the end of this negotiation.
Let's see what comes today and tomorrow for sure, to see, at least in the most immediate, the direction this is all headed. Admiral James Stavridis, it is great to see you again. Thank you.